thanks to you for inviting me. There's also a few other people I need to thank because of the research that this paper is based on. The IRCHSS is not widely known in Scotland, but it's the Irish Research Council for Humanities and Social Studies, who were kind enough to fund a large chunk of my PhD and postdoctoral work initially in Trinity College Dublin and subsequently in University College Dublin. There's a slight Dublin theme here, you may have gathered. And some of the things I'll be telling you about today will be based on that research. I'm also delighted that I have been asked, since moving to Glasgow, to become involved with the Pagan Norse Graves of Scotland project, which began about 20 years ago, but then sort of slowed down and fell by the wayside for various reasons, because now I'm delighted to say up and running again. The principal investigator is Professor James Graham Campbell, formerly of University College London, but I've been brought on board to give advice and also to write a couple of the chapters in a book that we hope will be published within the next 3 years on Viking burial, including the women's burials, which, as you're about to find out, will be the core of what I'm going to talk to you about this evening. I didn't realise when I put up this slide that Judith Jeschke was the person who gave last year's Hakon Hakonsson Lecture. Judith, back in 1991, published this wonderful book, Women in the Viking Age, which was the first major publication on this subject. At the time, she was very, very clear. She thought it was an open survey, and she sort of assumed that lots of other people were going to write on this subject subsequently. In actual fact, this remains the only major book on women in the Viking Age. But the opening sentence of that book is, I think, very, very telling. The opening sentence is this one here: Vikings are irredeemably male in the popular imagination. What Judith meant by that is that the default setting, the default idea for most people, as soon as they hear the word Viking, is that Vikings are men. Women are very much neglected. There is a tendency to assume that anyone involved with the Viking Age, who made anything in the Viking Age, who built anything in the Viking Age, was male. And there has been very, very little research interest in women. There have been some recent exceptions, and these exceptions, I think, are very, very interesting for a number of reasons. This is a report from an internet site about 2 years ago. This is an article published by a colleague of mine now based in Tasmania, strangely enough, Shane MacLeod, though he did most of the research for this while based in Stirling. He published an article called Warriors and Women, the Sex Ratio of Norse Migrants to Eastern England up to 900 AD, and it was published in 2011. About 5 years later, the media picked up on this and promptly decided that what Shane had actually written was a statement that, and to quote this, one of many, many websites which came out at the time, women Viking warriors existed, confounding sexist scientists everywhere. This wasn't exactly what Shane had written, but it does show you sort of the way in which people's minds work. What Shane had actually done was a study, not of Scotland, I'm afraid, but of Viking activity in Eastern England, where he traced the movements of the Great Army in England. As any of you who are familiar with the Vikings in England may be aware, the Great Army arrives in England in 865, and due to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, you can trace it from place to place and from campaign to campaign, year by year. What Shane MacLeod actually argued was that, although we think of the Great Army as exclusively male, there were actually, it's very clear, lots and lots of women who formed part of the Great Army as it moved around the country. And he used a range of archaeological and historical evidence to demonstrate that women were effectively camp followers, was the term which he used, and that as a result there were far more early women who settled in England when the Great Army split up to settle down in the area which became known as the Danelaw. What the media picked up was this idea that women were close to warriors, therefore women were warriors. And this popular misunderstanding has carried on sort of ever since. And this is another interesting example. My students are very, very keen on the television show, The Vikings. In fact, I think the reason I have any students at all sometimes is because of the television show, The Vikings. I'm not going to talk about the Vikings as the television show. I'm not going to talk about the perceptions, other than the way in which they portray women. As you'll be aware, at least women are now form part of the Vikings' narrative. But what seems to have The way in which the argument seems to work is this. Vikings were warriors, and warriors are powerful. Therefore, if you want to show that Viking women are powerful, you have to show them as warriors. And so what I find interesting, I have to admit I haven't seen all of the episodes of the Vikings. I tend to have to be taken out and given a quiet sit down about halfway through episodes. But there are remarkably few. All of the prominent female characters in the Vikings seem to be warriors, are certainly more than capable of fighting and fending for themselves. And this seems to be the way in which you portray powerful Viking women. And this is what I want to think about as part of this lecture. I am going to talk to you about Scottish Vikings and women in Viking Scotland, I promise, but I'm just kind of laying out, as it were, the stall before I plunge into it. We may not be completely wrong in suggesting that some Vikings were indeed women. You may be aware of the publication just last year, 2017, by Hedensteen Jonsson and a whole group of archaeological specialists who revisited Björka grave 581, one of the graves associated with the Swedish town of Birka, just to the west of modern Stockholm, where in this grave there was a figure buried with, as you can see from this reconstruction, a whole series of weapons: sword, axe head, spear, bow and arrow. However, they carried out a new DNA analysis of the skeleton and demonstrated conclusively that this skeleton was female, that this was a woman who was buried with weapons. In many ways, this answers a modern ideal. We're all used to concepts of gender equality. Certainly my students are firmly convinced that women should have been allowed to be warriors if they wanted to be, and something else that has gone viral on the internet. But there's been strong resistance to this idea in some quarters. Some people are really quite uncomfortable with the idea of women being warriors. And the debate now, I think, is moving on from whether or not the results were accurate or not. I think the results were absolutely accurate. And there's now a debate about, was there something quite exceptional about this woman? Was this a single individual? Or in actual fact, could this be the tip of the iceberg? If you sort of carry out detailed analysis of lots of skeletons buried with weapons, are you going to find that a much larger proportion than we thought were actually women? The key to the way we understand these gender roles is through furnished burial. One of the remarkable things about the Vikings, or at least some Vikings, was that they buried their dead with grave goods. They're one of the last cultures to do this in Western Europe, and the kinds of objects they placed in these graves form a central role in how we think about gender roles in the Viking Age and how we think about the roles of men and women in the Viking Age. Ideas about these burials and how you interpreted them came to the fore in the Victorian Age, and you can see here one of the leading scholars of the time, Jojo Vorsaj, a Danish scholar who got what I think must be the first ever academic travel grant from the King of Denmark to come to visit, to spend about 6 months traveling around Scotland, England, and Ireland in the 1840s. And he was one of the first to look at grave goods which we would now identify as Viking, to identify them as a Scandinavian origin, and to start thinking about gender roles. Because so much of what we think about the Vikings and men and women in the Viking Age was developed in the Victorian period, we're sometimes a bit skeptical about some of their ideas. To what extent does the ideas about women as sort of paragons of the domestic sphere and men as sort of active in the social sphere and active warriors actually relate to the Viking Age as opposed to the Victorian prejudices of those who developed the ideas? In terms of thinking about this and thinking about gender roles, it's quite interesting. Vorsaj, who I've just shown you, was actually completely unaware of gender issues in the Viking burial assemblage in Britain and Ireland. Vorsaj assumed that all the Vikings who came to Britain and Ireland were male. Didn't even bother looking for women. The idea that some of the graves which you find in these islands were actually the graves of women rather than men was developed by a Scot, Joseph Anderson, specifically looking at a set of burials which were found at a site called Ballin Abbey on Islay in 1879. 2 graves were found side by side. One of them containing, as you can see, a whole series of weapons, as well as a set of smith's tools. You can see the tongs there, and a hammer right beside it, a cauldron. That little glittery thing in the top left-hand corner is the terminal from a drinking horn. This material was in one of the graves. In the other grave, there was a set of oval brooches, a rather nice silver pin, some beads, a set of textile working tools in the top right-hand corner, a linen smoother and a heckle and a needle case. Anderson looked at this material and was the first person in English to suggest that this was clearly the grave of a husband and wife. How he knew they were married is beyond me, and that the one set of graves contained material that was distinctively male, the other grave contained material that was distinctively female. And really, Anderson's idea is what has dominated the way in which we think about Viking burial ever since. It also displayed some interesting, not Victorian, but rather Edwardian prejudices. This little object here that I've just shown you was originally interpreted as part of a Viking helmet. Because it was part of a Viking helmet, it was put in with the male grave goods. About 30 years later, somebody went back and looked at this material and realized it wasn't a helmet, it was a heckle, in other words, a comb for carding wool as part of the textile working process. Because it was involved with textiles, it couldn't possibly be from the male grave. It had to be a mistake. So they physically moved it into the other burial assemblage, assuming that the original antiquarian records had been wrong. So Anderson establishes this idea of clear gender roles in Viking society, and then this gets progressively reinforced, and if necessary, by physically moving artifacts from grave to grave to confirm these ideas. But the basic idea is actually sound. There really are discrete groups of artifacts in Viking graves which are rarely, if ever, found together. Weapons and smiths' tools tend to be found together. Smiths' tools aren't very common in Britain and Ireland. And oval brooches, other jewellery and textile tools are also found in discrete groups. You very rarely find textile working tools found in the same graves as weapons or vice versa. In as much as we have surviving skeletons from graves from Britain and Ireland, usually the skeletal sex corresponds to the gender roles of the artifacts. In other words, where you find swords and you can sex the skeleton, the people we have identified with swords tend to be male, and the people we find with oval brooches tend to be female. This suggests that there are very clear gender roles in Viking society, and that despite the Birka woman, we can rely to some extent on grave goods to think about gender roles in Viking society. And even with the Birka woman, what I think is interesting is that she only has male grave goods in her grave. There are no female objects at all. It's as though her gender role has changed completely. She's effectively been treated as a man. The other missing element of this is that not all Vikings are buried with gendered grave goods. There are a substantial group of graves which have achieved almost no attention, which contain lots of grave goods, sometimes an awful lot of grave goods, but none of which are gendered. These are variously known as ungendered graves because you can't use grave goods to determine gender. Gender neutral, which is a phrase we have borrowed from Anglo-Saxon studies and which I don't particularly like. Or in my PhD, I call them tertiary graves, that they were a third group of graves, male, female, and tertiary. A lot of people see these as problematic, and they're very frequently ignored in the literature, as you'll see as I move on. But they do exist, and they are real, and they're actually a very substantial group. I'm not suggesting that there were a substantial group of people in the Viking Age who formed, as it were, a third gender, just that not all Vikings were buried with gender-specific grave goods. This is an example from Neep on Lewis. In this case, it's a child's burial where the child was buried with 2 beads around its neck. Nothing that was in any way sort of gender-specific. Adults, however, it's not just a phenomenon associated with childhood. Adults can be buried with non-gender-specific grave goods as well. This brings us on to some interesting questions about the way in which we think about men and women in the Viking Age, and in particular about relative power and relative status. Vikings may not necessarily be irredeemably male in the popular imagination, but they're still seen as the dominant force. One of the things which fascinates me about the way in which we think about Vikings and describe Viking women and women's graves in particular is actually a very subtle thing that once you notice it occurs over and over again in the literature. Viking men are described always in the active voice. Viking men are buried with their grave goods, which they acquired as a result of their raiding activity and their migration into the west. Viking women are buried with the grave goods which their menfolk gave them as a result of having been brought with their menfolk to the Viking West. Once you begin to spot this way of writing about men and women in the Viking Age, you start spotting it occurring and reoccurring and reoccurring. It's extremely subtle, it's not academic, but it is very, very interesting. I don't believe in the passive voice. I think that if we are being serious about these burials, we need to think about the role of women, both in insular, that is to say in British and Irish contexts, and also specifically in the context of the Scottish landnam, that is to say the Scottish land taking. I want to move on now, finally. So there's an awfully long introduction, but I think unless you get to the general idea of some of the issues we have with thinking about Viking women generally, there's no point in springing straight into Scotland. Though, as you're about to find out, Scotland's a really, really interesting case study. My PhD did something slightly odd in that I decided I was going to look at Viking burial across Britain and Ireland. Most people who look at Viking burials tend to zoom in on details. So people have written superb PhDs on Viking burial in Orkney or Viking burial in the Western Isles. I decided I want to pull back from that and think about general patterns, to think about variations in the record across Britain and Ireland. And this is the result of more years of research than I should probably admit to. I managed to find 379 Viking burials, that is to say graves of Viking age date that contain grave goods. I didn't consider unfurnished burials. These are spread, as you can see through this map, between 194 sites. It's a very dispersed pattern. Almost 3/4 of Viking graves are the only furnished burials at the site where they occur. In contrast, only about 1 in 20 Viking cemeteries contains more than 5 graves. So it's a very, very dispersed pattern, and that's particularly true of Scotland. In terms of gender across these islands, there are 200 burials with male grave goods, weapons. Actually, there's no grave which is gendered male that doesn't contain at least one weapon. 60 graves that contain female gendered artifacts, primarily oval brooches, and 119 of this completely ignored ungendered group, where they contain grave goods but they're not specifically male or female. What that means is that 260 burials across these islands are gendered, 77% are male, 23% are female. So it does look as though the majority of those moving from Scandinavia to Scotland, to England, to Ireland are male, that women are, as it were, in the minority. I won't kind of bore you with various statistical permutations of my thesis, but this gives you a rough idea. This is a pie chart showing that just over half of all burials, the ones in orange, are male. Then the ones in blue are these ungendered burials. And then you've got slim green bands of various categories of female graves. So it looks as though women are effectively in the minority. However, one of the first things which you have to realize when you start thinking about men and women, in particular this idea of women as as passive migrants, if you like, brought by their menfolk, is that using archaeological methods, we cannot find a period in Scotland, England, or Ireland where women are not present. Women are among the earliest migrants to these islands. What is interesting is where this early activity occurs. There's 3 groups. Orkney is maybe perhaps not that surprising, that Orkney would be one of the first places settled on the journey from Norway. There's also a really interesting group of early graves, both male and female, around Islay and Colonsay and Oronsay, quite a large concentration. And then there's a 3rd group in my hometown, Dublin, which is also typologically very, very early. So all of the early artifacts are located in these 3 places. You'll notice, of course, that 2 of those are in Scotland, and so women are fundamental, I would argue, to very early Viking settlement in Scotland, and as you trace the development of Viking burial in Scotland, they remain a crucial part of this process and remain very important and statistically as part of the evidence. So let's zone in on Scotland. I have an awful confession to make. Because I was doing a study of Britain and Ireland, I decided I would ignore modern national borders. So you will notice that I've drawn blue lines here. My group B included both the Western Isles and Northern Ireland, Northeastern Ireland, on the grounds that that was a single cohesive group, at least from purposes of travelling by sea. And the various graves of the Solway Firth, Dumfries and Galloway, I grouped as a unit as well. For the purposes of this lecture, I've split up those groups. And we have about 140 graves across Scotland, spread between 84 sites. So it's just over a third of all burial sites are within the modern Scotland. 58 of these are male, 39 are female, and then just 46 ungendered. There's also a group of 3 that have been excavated but never actually published, so we're not certain. This suggests that there's something different going on in Scotland and something we need to think about very carefully. Nobody has necessarily had the figures to hand, but people have known that the proportion of female graves in Scotland is higher for a while. And the classic way of describing this is to say that what's going on in Scotland is different to what's going on in the rest of Britain and Ireland. One of the classic arguments is that Viking settlement in Scotland is in some way more domestic than what's going on further south. That the kinds of settlements they build in Scotland are more directly comparable to burials in Norway, and that the proportions of male and female graves are more balanced because the kinds of society they're setting up in Scotland is more comparable to Norway. And you can think of that in terms of settlement rather than burial. The contrast between the very complex site of Jarlshof with its longhouses, which is clearly a rural site, and, for example, the winter camp at Repton, which some of you may be familiar with, which is usually seen as a much more military site with a preponderance of men. Often this is described in terms of Scotland being closer to Norway. Conviction, if you will, that women are more prone to seasickness than men and less likely to travel long distances, and the idea that the North Scottish landscape is more comparable to Norway, and so settlers are happier to live there. Domestic settlement's a more interesting question, but certainly the close to Norway argument is something that we can sort of seriously question. If you go back to the 1920s and even to the 1970s, the idea occurs and reoccurs. There's a really common argument out there that the graves of the Northern Isles and Caithness, because they're closest to Norway, are the graves of the same kind of peasant society that is Norwegian in itself, whereas the Western Isles are effectively more akin to the raiding sites further south. So the argument is that there are more women and more domestic sites in Orkney than when compared to anywhere in the Western Isles, particularly in the south, where it's argued that a lot of the graves actually relate to raiders. These are people who are going south every year, raiding and then coming back up to their settlement. If you look at the proportions of male and female graves in these two areas, however, you'll see there's almost no difference. In the north, it's 58% male, 42% female. In the Western Isles, it's 62% male and 38% female. Archaeologically speaking, that's not significant. It's a random kind of a occurrence. The proportion of female graves in Western and Northern Scotland is effectively the same. So there are as many women settling in the Western Isles as in the north. Another classic argument is that the graves in the West are more high status. Orkney is all about peasant settlement, lots and lots of relatively low status individuals living up there as compared to the pirate chieftains, if you like, of the Western Isles. If you look at the statistics for the Western Isles, these are the proportions of numbers of grave goods per grave from the Western Isles. And you'll see there's a steady petering out. Most graves contain 1 or 2 grave goods, and then those figures gradually peter out. And there's a single grave with 17 grave goods. If you compare that to the Northern Isles, you'll notice the pattern is almost identical. So the graves of the Northern Isles are as well furnished as the graves of the Western Isles. So again, this idea of a peasant settlement in the Northern Isles, an aristocratic settlement and aristocratic burials in the Western Isles, that really doesn't hold water anymore. Instead, it looks as though what's going on in the West and in the North is really very, very similar. You'll also notice that although we have this idea that Viking graves are predominantly male and predominantly well furnished, if you look at the green strips that you can see there, red are male graves, green are female graves. And you'll notice that there's actually a real correspondence between them. It's not that women's graves are poorly furnished, male graves are very well furnished. There's actually a substantial group of women's graves that have lots of grave goods in them that you can compare directly. Usually in archaeological terms, if you have equal numbers of grave goods, you start thinking about equal status. One of the interesting questions we need to ask ourselves before we go on any further, however, is what we are looking at when we look at Viking graves. Traditionally, we have thought about Viking graves in Scotland and the rest of Britain and Ireland as essentially ethnic markers. You are a Viking, and so you are buried with grave goods because you were a Viking. To some extent that is true. No other population group in Scotland or anywhere else in these islands are burying their dead with grave goods. But the assumption that all Vikings are buried with grave goods is something which comes directly from Norwegian scholarship. Anton Brogger, for example, writing in the 1920s, was convinced that Norwegian graves containing grave goods were the graves of what he called bonner. The usual translation is peasants. That has kind of connotations in English. Effectively, he's talking about a group of free farmers. So Brugge and most Norwegian archaeologists of the time were absolutely convinced that effectively all Vikings were buried with grave goods. It was part of the cultural package. If you go and look at the evidence in Norway, however, you start to spot some problems. There are approximately 7,000 furnished burials in Norway, that in the area marked in purple on the map. This is the latest figure I could get. It's from about 2012 by Frans Arne Stulegar. They date very wide date range, AD 400 to 1000, unlike the very narrow band of Viking burial in Britain and Ireland, which is about 100 years between 850 and 950. 7,000 sounds like loads. Loads and loads and loads and loads of graves. However, spread between over 600 years, it starts getting less impressive all the time. If you assume a 30-year generation and divide that 7,000 by 30, you get 350 people per generation being buried with grave goods. That's in a country 2,500 kilometers long. The assumption, if every Viking was being buried with grave goods, we would have found far, far, far more than we have. Clearly, only a fraction of the Scandinavian population are being buried with grave goods. And the most easy explanation of why only some Vikings are being buried with grave goods is status. If you're more important in society, you're likely to be buried with grave goods. If you're less important, you're not. This obviously has a big impact on the way in which you think about male and female graves in Scotland. There's an even more interesting study. If you don't believe me when I say that not all Vikings are being buried with grave goods, there's an even more interesting statistical study, which was carried out by Bergliot Solberg in 1985. She did a detailed study of the 3 areas of Norway you can see here. She identified a total of 4,629 graves. It's less than Stulegar's figures because she's only looking at part of Norway. They were Merovingian and Viking, so slightly narrower band, about 550 to 1000 AD. The key thing about her findings was her male-female ratio. She completely ignored the ungendered burials that I've been talking about. She just, unless there were gendered artifacts, as far as she was concerned, it wasn't a Viking grave. She found 3,796 male graves and 833 female graves. In other words, 82% of all the Norwegian burials with grave goods were male, and only 18% of graves were female. If these figures are an accurate reflection of the Norwegian population in the Viking Age, they had a far more pressing reason for leaving Norway than any amount of plundering of monasteries. There have been attempts to explain this. The current rave theory, which you may have heard about, is selective female infanticide. Vikings didn't particularly like raising girls because they were expensive and you had to provide a dowry for them when they grew up. So you killed all your female children and encouraged your male children to grow to adulthood. I don't believe that. I'm happy to talk about all the reasons why I don't believe that afterwards if you like, but I don't believe that. A much more reasonable explanation of this figure is that if you are a man in Viking Age Scandinavia, you are vastly more likely to be buried with grave goods than if you're a woman. So, but the Norwegian proportion of male and female graves is not 50-50. One of the things which has beggared the way in which you think about women's graves in Scotland and elsewhere has been the assumption that the Norwegian pattern is 50-50. In actual fact, the Scottish burial pattern is nearly equal to that of Scandinavia. The other thing which we discovered is that, and this is another reason why I think selective female infanticide doesn't work, is that the proportions of male and female graves fluctuate continuously, both through time and through space. There are parts of Norway where you're always more likely to be buried with grave goods if you're a woman, and there are periods of Norwegian history where the proportion of women's graves skyrockets. One of them is actually in the Viking Age, in the 9th and 10th century, and particularly in coastal areas. And it's been argued that possibly because the men are away raiding so much, women take on extra social responsibilities, and this is reflected in the social status and the grave goods. But the highest proportion ever found anywhere in Norway is a ratio of 2 male graves to every 1 female grave, or 66% male, 34% female. So the Scottish proportions are effectively equivalent to those parts of Norway with the most female graves, and there are actually more women buried with grave goods in Scotland than across entire tracts of Norway. So something really unusual is going on in Scotland. It's not just that lots of women are settling, it's that for some reason their female burial with grave goods takes on a new social significance and a new social importance. It's not just about statistics and status, however. One of the big changes in our understanding of Viking ritual and religious practice, I think, over the last 20 years, has been the realization that these graves with grave goods are not just graves in the Christian sense. They're not just places where you place your dead. There is a really strong belief in practice in Scandinavia of communicating with the dead in many ways, or certainly of respecting them. And a classic example of this in terms of transformation is Oseberg. Most of you are probably familiar with the Oseberg ship, found in 1904 but built in the very early 9th century. What fantastically furnished burial, very, very rich, and of course the grave of 2 women, as most of you will be aware. Recent discoveries have been really interesting. The Oseberg ship, you can see here, they've dug right the way down to the pit where the boat was originally buried. That was covered with a huge burial mound. But what we've only recently realized is that that mound was built in 2 stages. They built half the burial mound, as you can see here, in such a way that they still had access to the burial chamber. And it was left like that for about 10 or 15 years, with people able to get into the burial chamber. And only then was the second half of the mound built and the whole thing sealed off. We have no idea what was going on there, but it clearly had a real ritual significance. And it's a ritual significance focused on a female grave. Another explanation relates to a less abstract or less spiritual concept, and that's about inheritance. This is the work of Dagfinn Skræ, primarily, that I'm basing this on. Dagfinn has done a lot of work on various sites across Norway where, and this is just an example from Vestvågøy in the Lofoten Islands. I dug very close to this at one point, which is the reason I picked this one. Right the way across Norway, you tend to find groups of burial mounds, the little black dots, right beside groups of longhouses. They're burying their dead right beside where they live, effectively. Skræ looked at the statistics and said, if you look at these burial mounds, there's 1 grave about every 30 years, or 2 graves every 30 years or so. What happens every 20 or 30 years? The previous owner of the farm dies and somebody else inherits it. If you live in a society that doesn't have written records, there's no charter or land deeds that can actually demonstrate your ownership of land, what better way to demonstrate that you are now in control of a given property than to bury the previous property owner with the full rights and ranks of his status, all the things that demonstrate how important he was, thus demonstrating to the world at large who were attending the funeral that you were equally important and that you were now in charge of the land. I think it's a very, very persuasive argument, and you can imagine that if this is an important idea in Scandinavia, then for a group of Scandinavian migrants who are arriving in Scotland and elsewhere for the first time, this idea of linking yourself to the ground through a burial must have been at least equally important and perhaps even more important. Is it possible that the burials of Scotland are actually, to some extent at least, about land ownership? We know certainly that the Vikings pick very specific sites to be buried in. In terms of landscape, they will specifically target coastal sites close to good bays, and they will go for relatively high ground, usually at one end or the other of the bay. That's the classic way of burial pattern. What that means is that if you're sailing in and out of that particular bay or that particular harbour, you sail past burial mounds. So it's a physical reminder to people that that mound is there. Why do you own this land? I own this land because I inherited it from the person who's buried in that burial mound right up there. If you think in those terms, then the fact there are so many women's graves potentially says something really interesting about the role of women in Viking society. Both of these sites, by the way, is a small cemetery of 5 graves, the most richly furnished of one of which is a woman, most richly furnished by far. And the other site, Braeswick, is also a woman's grave. So these are 2 female examples. Another really interesting thing about Scotland is the pattern of site reuse. Most Viking burials do occur at sites where there's already some kind of activity that's taken place, rather than completely new sites. So 29 sites across Scotland, the green dots you can see there, are sites where Viking burials are consciously placed on existing prehistoric sites. The classic pattern is the one of Tote on Skye, which you can see here, an existing Neolithic burial mound, and they literally scraped out a pit at the top of the mound, put a Viking grave in there, and patted the ground down and moved on. There's another 10 sites, the red dots, primarily in the south, where they bury their dead with Viking rituals, but at Christian sites. A classic way of explaining this, particularly the reuse of prehistoric sites, is that Vikings are a bit lazy. There's a perfectly good burial mound there. Why on earth would we bother digging another burial mound if that mound is there? And we'll just reuse it, thank you very much. The other possibility is this is in some way trying to link your dead to a recognizably ancient past. This mound has been there time out of mind as far as the local community are concerned. Your dead are now buried in that mound and you were linking yourself to that ancient past and ancient ideals. One of the striking things is that not all of these ancient sites are actual burial mounds, as we would think of them today. So at Gurness, for example, where there's a well-furnished woman's grave in Orkney, it's a Broch site, which has looked like a mound in the Viking Age. At Wisedale in Shetland, it's a burnt mound, a Bronze Age kind of cooking structure. Really interesting are Ospedale, which is the hollow circle in Sutherland, and Ballinabbey on Islay, where the dead are placed beside standing stones. Standing stones are really interesting because Norwegian Viking graves aren't buried beside standing stones. It's a completely different burial ritual. These standing stones, however, are clearly ancient monuments, and the Vikings are placing their dead at the feet of these ancient monuments, linking themselves to this ancient past. And this, I think, can be best seen as part of the process of actually embedding themselves in the landscape, if you will. Women also seem to be very, very prominent in lots of cemeteries. I've just mentioned Neep. You've just seen it on the map, and this is that well-furnished woman's grave I mentioned. There are 5 other furnished burials at that site, but all of them contain 1 or 2 grave goods, no more. This single female burial contains a pair of oval brooches, an incredible necklace, a ringed pin, a knife, a sickle, strap ends indicating a belt. It's a really, really elaborate, well-furnished burial, and it's the best furnished of the group. Scar and Orkney. It's a single burial within a boat, but with 3 bodies in it. And again, in the case of Scar, it's clearly the elderly woman. She was in her 60s when she was buried, very well furnished, and she's in the most prominent position within the boat. We know the male body went in second because they actually broke his foot to actually fit him into the space that was left by the woman sooner than actually disturb that female burial. So you can see this pattern. It's not just there are lots of women's graves, it's that they're really well furnished and they're in prominent positions. There's an even more interesting pattern if you compare it to detailed studies in Norway. Thomas Ness, leading figure in the 1980s, did a study of Sognefjord, which is this area here in south-central Norway. And I'll just enlarge that there. She did a study of male and female burials, again completely ignoring the ungendered ones, up and down Sognefjord. And what she discovered was that women's graves in this area occur at large cemeteries that already have lots and lots of male graves. So you don't really get isolated women's graves. You get single male graves up and down the valley, all right, but female graves only occur at established cemeteries where there are also male burials. In Scotland, 17 of the 33 isolated sites only have a single female burial in them. So if you think about these burials as expressions of land ownership and rank, it looks as though in Scotland, unlike Scandinavia, you have a situation where a woman's grave can perform the function of linking you to the landscape, of actually connecting you to the ground. You don't need a male burial as well. The woman's grave is carrying out that social function. And I think that has to indicate that in Scotland, for reasons, to be honest, we don't fully understand, women and women's burial rights in particular have a social significance that they don't have anywhere else we know of in the Viking world. So women in Scotland have a particular social prominence, which we're only starting to become aware of. And there's other really interesting examples and issues going on as well. This is one of my favorite examples, and this is also one of my last examples. This is a burial at a site called Carnavarich on Oronsay. It's a boat burial, and it's another boat burial with, in this case, with 2 women and 1 man in it. One of the women is buried fairly conventionally with a set of oval brooches. Viking women wore a pair of oval brooches at their chests, effectively, which held up an overdress. What's really interesting about Carnavarich is that instead of oval brooches, we found these things. These are a pair of hinges from an Irish shrine. However, they're a matching set, and they were converted into brooches by adding pins and catch plates at the back of them. So it's an antiquarian find. It was one of these mounts was actually found attached to the clavicle, the shoulder bone of this woman. What that means is this woman was buried dressed like a Scandinavian and dressed like a high-status Scandinavian woman. But for some reason, she didn't have a set of oval brooches. They hadn't been available when she left Scandinavia, either because she wasn't married or because she wasn't a sufficiently high social rank when she left Scandinavia. So they took these 2 very insular objects from a Christian context, converted them into brooches so that she could be buried looking as like a Scandinavian woman as they could. So it's not just that women's status is kind of passively reflecting what's going on in Scandinavia. There are points when they can actually pick this up and change it and adapt it and increase their status. I think it's an absolutely extraordinary site. As a final point, the other thing to think about is the way in which we think about tools and tool use. If you go back to Ballan Abbey, smith's tools. This is a Viking buried with smith's tools. This clearly indicates that Vikings were very good craft workers, that this particular Viking must have been a smith, and that smiths were socially respected, and hence buried with these grave goods. In contrast, when you find textile working tools with women, there's at least one classic interpretation of this, which argues that while men get to go to Valhalla and fight all day and feast all night, women are expected to spend their entire afterlife in domestic drudgery. If you're going to argue that smiths' working tools for men are expressions of status, you have to argue that textile working tools are expressions of female status as well. You cannot form an argument which is gender specific at that level. Textile working is, of course, incredibly important in the Viking Age, and I can't go into this, but there's this distinct becoming aware of the possibility that some of these tools, both in terms of female and male activities, may actually have ritual significance that we haven't been aware of previously, and could even potentially be linked to cults of Freya in the case of women and Wayland in the case of men. Just to give you some kind of recap and some key points, I argue very strongly, as you may have gathered, that the role of women has actually been downplayed far too much in early settlement. They are part of the early settlement. They're a significant part of the early settlement, particularly in Scotland. The burial evidence, I would argue, is critical, and it reflects community leaders. Not everybody is buried with grave goods. These are key figures, major landowners, leaders of armies, that kind of thing. Most Vikings are being buried without grave goods, and because they're buried without grave goods, it's almost impossible to spot them in the archaeological record. High-status women migrate in significant numbers, and they migrate in significant numbers to Scotland in particular. I think that's the only way that you can get this. At some level, the burial rite is changing, and women are more likely to be buried, but that still almost certainly means that lots of women were settling in Scotland. I'm not arguing that Viking society isn't patriarchal. Of course it's a patriarchal society. But I think it's a mistake to say that because it's patriarchal, women have no power whatsoever. Those are two different arguments. I think that the grave goods and the assemblages point to a specific kind of female power, one which does not rely on them taking up weapons and acting like men, but rather relying on a specific set of social circumstances which they can exploit, which they can take advantage of, and which the burial evidence shows clearly reflects Viking society. Research, I should point out, is ongoing. It's quite likely that the current Pagan Norse Graves of Scotland project will change these statistics slightly. However, they're broadly correct. I don't think we're going to miraculously find another 30 or 40 male graves that are going to skew the statistics massively. But hopefully I've shown you that this is, well, I think it's a fascinating subject, and I think it's certainly worth the ongoing research. And thank you all very much for your patience and listening to me.
A vote of thanks is going to be given by the Honourable President of the Society, Patrick Lord Glasgow.
I would like to thank Stephen and Harrison very much indeed for what I think we all agree was a really terrific talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.